I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ryan Speech from the University of Michigan. He's an associate professor in the departments of Romance languages and literatures and Judaic studies, and affiliated in the Department of Comparative Literature. He works on the intersection of medieval Jewish-Christian Muslim polemics and literary texts in Iberia, and has focused in particular on Abner of Burgos, Alfonso of Valladolid. In addition to a number of articles, he has published last year a book, Conversion, the Narrative, Reading and Religious Authority in Medieval Polemic, and has edited a book that is currently in press, Medieval Exegesis and Religious Difference, Conflict, Contact, and Community in the Pre-Modern Mediterranean, forthcoming from Fordham University Press. And most interestingly, he is currently working on a team led by George Hasselhoff from Universitat of Bochum to produce an edition of the Pugio Fidei by Ramon Martí. He's also co-editing with George Ledo an edition of the Confutación del Alcorán of Lope de Obregón. So Professor Speech will speak on conversion as a historiographical problem. Please. Let's fix the mic.
Yeah, give it a moment.
Well, warming up. Is that okay? Well, I don't know if it's because of my sins or my virtues that I was placed in this precarious position between you and your wine. So I'll try to make it as painless as possible. But I was thinking your remarks about the rooster story and earlier remarks about conversion as a bodily experience and an issue of the body and the blood got me thinking about a story I had heard about a Franciscan and a Dominican who were not satisfied with what they had for offerings in Iberia as far as Jews and Muslims were concerned, so they decided to travel somewhere else where they might find some better subjects to convert, and they ended up lost at sea and finally washed ashore in Papua New Guinea, where they said, well, we'll see what we can do here. So they went out and found two indigenous guys from Papua New Guinea and immediately said, aha, are you converted? And they said, well, I don't know. What does it mean to be converted? And one of them said, well, you have to eat of the body and the blood. And he said, oh, are you converted? And he said, yes, yes, Jesus is in my heart. He said, okay, well. So then the two indigenous people took one each of the friars and went back to their home villages. The next week they met, and the two indigenous guys were talking, and the one said to the other, are you converted? And he said, yes, I am converted. I've eaten of the body and the blood. And he said, oh, how was it? He said, it's great. Oh, I put him in some hot oil and, prepared him with some salt. It was delicious. Are you converted? He said to his friend. He said, no, I couldn't get him down. It was terrible. Why is that? He said, well, I made a soup out of him. I put him in hot water and tried to make a nice broth. He said, oh, there's your problem. You see, he's a friar. So, with that in mind, sorry, I wasn't going to, and then you told the rooster story, and I thought it's just going from bad to worse. It's a race to the bottom. So I'll turn the clock back. My interest is actually in those friars before 1492. I'll tell a different story. An anonymous Muslim chronicler who had witnessed the end of Nasrid rule in Granada was the first to tell this story, the story of a captive girl, Isabel of Solís, who was captured in the skirmishes between Muslims and Christians in the 1470s and given as a slave girl to King Abul Hassan, better known to posterity as Muley Hassan, who ruled Granada for over 2 decades until 1485. And Muley Hassan's wife, Aisha, had already given birth to a son, Muhammad XII, who would eventually become Boabdil, the legendary last Moor whose sighing retreat from Granada has become memorialized as the dying gasp of Andalusi society. But the wife and the son were not enough to keep this Moulay Hassan's fancy from becoming attached to a different girl, Isabel, who, as the historian of Granada, Rachel Arié, tells us in his eminent history of the Nasrids, she was, quote, called Zoraya after her conversion to Islam. And according to later legend, the feud between Zoraya and Hassan's wife and cousin Aisha was said to have weakened the Nasrid kingdom. For Boabdil sided with his mother and eventually took over the throne, but was then overtaken by the Catholic kings in a moment of weakness after infighting. And Boabdil lost Granada to Ferdinand and Isabel, we're told, by the Sicilian chronicler in Castile, Lucio Siculo, in the 16th century, and so she returned to her... What's that? Yes. So he says that she caused the downfall of Granada, and so she returned to her original religion, took back the name Isabel, and established residence in Seville. Now her identity, too, is the stuff of legend. Of course, even numerous historical novels have been written about her life, and 2 were published in the last decade. But her existence and her general trajectory can be traced, at least in part, with some very solid documentation. It's known that she was the Christian daughter of a Castilian nobleman, Sancho Jiménez de Solís, who was mayor of La Peña de Martos, a little city near Jaén, that she was captured in a Muslim raid on a certain day, we know, sold as a slave, and that she must have become a Muslim around 1480. And we're told by chronicler Hernando de Baeza in 1510 that she was later called La Romilla, or the female Rum, the female European. That is, as it says, este nombre suelen llamar los moros a las cristianas que se tornan moras. That is, this name, Romilla, is what Moors usually call Christian women who become Muslim women, se tornan moras. We know that the Muslim sons she bore then to King Hassan were called Sa'ad and Nasr, and that they were later baptized by the Bishop of Guadix on April 30th, 1492, and were later known as Juan de Granada and Fernando de Granada in later years, and became eminent Christians and writers in the humanist tradition. But we know that also this woman of multiple names, Zoraya, Rumia, Isabel, is still called a Mora, a female Muslim, in various sources, even in 1494, including letters directly from Queen Isabella herself. And this Zoraya then seems to have reverted to Christianity somewhere around 1500, and is no longer called the former Queen of Granada after then, when she's just called Isabel again. And in documents dating between 1501 and 1510, she's only a Christian until she disappears from the historical record. Now, my goal is not to reconstruct her history or to trace her legend any more than that, but I wanted to introduce her story, this story of the multiple named Isabel, the Christian, Zoraya, La Romilla, the converted Muslim, Isabel, the reverted Christian, former Queen of Granada, etc., etc., and introduce her story as a way of getting at my topic, which is a bit difficult to pin down. That is, conversion as a problem, a historiographical problem in particular. For we can sift this legend from this fact, but what do we know about her conversion? What we're calling her conversion, or her conversions, or reversions at the center of this story. The way in which we explain the question of when she converted first, when she became Zoraya, or when she reverted and again became Isabel, depends very much on how we define this term, conversion. Was it when she professed Islam publicly, what she must have done around 1480 or 1481? What did that entail? Or perhaps she was ready to convert before, as a way to escape from an overbearing father, or perhaps to run away with a man, like her contemporary Christian musician, Garci Fernandez de Gerena, whom we know converted to Islam to follow a beautiful Mooress to Granada. But perhaps Isabel, like Garci Fernandez, never really converted. For how can one really convert if one doesn't believe? How can she revert if she does believe? Or perhaps she never did revert. Perhaps it was all a pretense just for keeping her land. We don't know. Was it ceremony or faith? Was it sincere or calculated or feigned? Was it done willingly or under duress? Would it be called conversion anyway if she were forced? I don't know. What if she were faking? What if we had a document that said, I'm faking? It's not that we lack documents about her situation, but rather that there are no documents that can properly address these questions. Does conversion refer to social affiliation or to belief or something else entirely? And here I'm evoking the same ambiguity I think, that Chaim alluded to in his opening remarks about Herman Judah. An ambiguity that I'll point out that has not stopped certain eminent historians from talking about Herman and others as representatives of the mentality of the medieval Jewish apostate, for example. Trying to avoid these kinds of assertions, I want to ask, how can we write her history without filling in the gaps that are underscored by my questions, or indeed deciding which gaps need to be filled in, and which questions that I've asked need to be answered? To discuss Isabel's conversion, which really seems essential in writing the history of her role in late Nasrid Granada and in writing the history of the ruling elite in the final years of the Nasrid kingdom. But to write her history is problematic, not for lack of documents, but because to make religious sense of this change, or any change, in a historical context, requires our decisions about meanings that are not based on any objective or even commonly shared parameters. So what I'd like to argue in the next few minutes, as this case shows, and I think others will show, is that the topic of conversion, as we've defined it in this conference, as we use it commonly in our discussions, in our writing, presents us with a historiographical problem, because it is not a fact, but a culturally determined figure of language, rather than a generally recognizable, uniformly or universally meaningful phenomenon. It is a metaphor, I think, that we apply across a broad and shifting range of extremely varied and sometimes even contradictory meanings. And yet it is a problem that historians and academics are very loath to recognize as such, for what would we do without it? What would we call our conference if we didn't have it? But a problem it certainly is, and the more we seek to pin it down, the more it seems to slip away. The more we try to treat it as an externally recognizable reality, the more we find simply a nimbus of culturally determined and variable phenomena and ideas. I can ask more questions. Is it a formal change of religion, a sacrament, a ceremony, an experience, an action? Is it an enduring process of renewal? Or is it all of these things? Must it be one of them at least? Is it an expression of the individual agency, or somehow subjugating that agency to larger social norms and rituals? Can the convert be said to convert without ever acting? Can the convert be said to convert if he doesn't believe, or if he's mentally feeble, or too young, or forced, or in a dream, etc.? To begin to answer these questions, or even to distinguish between a formal change of affiliation and a sincere change of feeling, as we tried to do a little bit earlier, requires a series of decisions about the nature and meaning of religious experience and identity. Decisions I don't think we're prepared to make. And it is uniquely dangerous to try to settle these questions within the context of religious historiography, because unlike other imprecise categories of thought on which we build our historiography and that we use to make sense of human interaction, conversion, and in quotes, in its most stereotypical or generic form, as a shorthand in the social sciences, as this kind of turn of heart that's overlaid on social affiliation in a shifting way. This idea, I think, is actually a particularly Christian product, one that by its nature is implicated in the very thing that we're trying to describe from without. Consider the following statement by historian Richard Fletcher in his thick and admirable study, The Barbarian Conversions. He says, "The spectacle of early medieval conversion to Christianity, or indeed to Islam, or indeed, in some circumstances, consider the Khazars, to Judaism, is generally not one of individuals acting upon conviction." Unquote. Now, on the surface, such a statement makes sense. Yet if we stop to think about what Fletcher is assuming, that somehow becoming Christian or Muslim or Jewish were somehow a comparable operation, that they made sense in a parallel way, that they all somehow might, in some circumstance, place an emphasis on social ritual rather than individual conviction, that's worth remarking upon, because it's not expected. If we think about it for a while, we realize that Fletcher's assuming quite a lot in saying what we seem to think might be obvious. And we see, just in this little statement, that the subject of conversion here is ridiculously large and beyond any sensible generalizing. That the attempts at generalizing, ill-advised as they are, too easily fall back onto presentist and particularly post-medieval and even Protestant caricatures of conviction and action and motive. That is, seemingly detached or critically balanced accounts of beliefs and actions rely on eminently modern conceptions of selfhood and agency. As Webb Keane has, I think, rightly asserted, quote, "Much of contemporary academic and political talk about agency continues to incorporate some of the assumptions about authenticity and liberation found in Christian discourse about paganism. At the same time, Christian conversion or conversion in general is an amorphous reality that cannot really be translated into the language of chronology, or fact even, without some kind of distortion. Not distortion of a factual reality into a misconstrued historiographical version, but I think a distortion of one culturally bound representation into another, more familiar representation that seems somehow more real, one that we expect to be coherent. To speak of conversion in terms of facts, dates, locations, events, is at least to give religious change a certain shape, to distinguish it from other possible shapes, to reify a culturally determined metaphor of variable meaning into a coherent and solid, coherent, sensible form. And then we treat that shape as if it has a certain reality that can be historically observed, dated, chronicled, placed onto a graph, compared across time. This is, I think, to confuse our category with the thing we're categorizing. I'm suggesting here, in short, that conversion in a historiographical context is factitious, a product as much of our own categories and assumptions as the thing itself we're talking about, the thing we purport to analyze and understand, and that we somehow do come to make sense of. But I would urge us to spend more time reflecting on what we actually mean when we use this word conversion in any given historical context, before moving on to even organize the information we think we know, and certainly before trying to compare it across periods, or even worse, across religions. So before going any further, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not calling conversion factitious or unreal. I don't mean, by saying it's factitious, I don't mean to argue that people did not change religious beliefs or affiliations, or that we can't talk about that in a certain meaningful way. What I do mean, rather, is that we can only speak about conversion in a limited, narrow sense according to the very particular situations we're analyzing, not in general terms across many situations, historical periods, or different religions or sects. Because there is, I think, no one coherent category that can really hold together all of these variable manifestations of religious change. To insist on reducing these complex certain circumstances to a common denominator of facts, to dig down to in our subject until we think we find a common bedrock of historical reality, is to insist that conversion is coherent enough to be analyzed like, say, the Crusades, the Gregorian Reform, the Schism, or even the pogroms of 1391. This is to misconstrue facts according to just a single, limited idea of what might be happening. The historian of Inner Asia, Devin DeVries, has succinctly stated the problem in his study of conversion narratives to Islam in Central Asia, when he says, conversion, quote, I'm quoting, conversion is inevitably a process of such considerable psychological and social complexity that even a thorough reconstruction of the historical setting and events that occurred, even a precise description of what happened, could not convey the significance of conversion as it's understood or felt religiously by the adherents of the new faith and their communal heirs. How then can we pretend to write a coherent history? What are conversion's facts? Certainly we have plenty of facts, but what does it mean to say that a conversion happens at any certain moment or doesn't happen in any one given moment? How can we distinguish between the inner and outer manifestations of conversion, that is, between what we're calling adhesion and conversion? How can we decide as historians on what grounds to give precedence over one as more authentically representing conversion than another? How can we try to apply one paradigm of belief, that is, this idea of religious change as it exists in what Jan Assmann identifies as exclusive religious traditions, that is, where you can't be in two at the same time, to multiple different religious experiences and phenomenon, sometimes in traditions that have no word that corresponds. The fact that conversion can point equally to internal conviction or external affiliation, or to any other combination of those two things, indicates that the questions we're asking come with a very serious hermeneutic burden that we must take up by defining the relationship between what we think is subjective and objective meaning on the one hand, and individual and collective experience on the other. And perhaps more importantly, the significance that DeVries speaks of and others, which could manifest itself in many different ways and prove unmeasurable in many others, but this difference might itself be construed as part of the actual conversion we're talking about. That is, conversion is the construct of the community. It's not a fact we're observing from without. It is the narrative told and shared by those who believe in it. It's as much adhesion and conversion and many other things. And in fact, who are we to say it's more one than the other? Is it a matter of belief? You tell me. So what I'm suggesting is that what we can say in theology or psychology or anthropology or sociology, and to be sure, history, is necessarily different and necessarily incomplete. And when we approach this conversion, this idea of conversion historically, any failure on our part to address these severe limitations taints our discourse with prejudices, deep prejudices, about the nature of faith and identity. Carl Morrison has already said this 20 years ago when he remarked, "It is a confusion of categories to use the word conversion as though it were an instrument of critical analysis, equally appropriate to any culture or religion." And he goes on that there is no general morphology of conversion applicable to conversion as a universal human experience. Now, what he's thinking about here has been developed very successfully by a number of writers like Jean-Claude Schmitt. That is, to employ the word conversion in scholarship, even on the poster, like using the word identity or agency, already is presuming a methodology, already presuming a worldview on our part as interpreters. And to confuse the assumptions of these methodologies with the elements that we purport to analyze is a very dangerous and misleading confusion of history and historiography. And I believe that medieval historiography in particular has yet to take stock and fully respond to this challenge presented by Morrison and Schmitt. To say what Webb Keen reminds us of again, if conversion has historical implications, then history has moral implications. And to be thinking that we are free from such implications, that we can get by without taking more careful stock of our own role in the perpetuation of those assumptions, is a dangerous kind of intellectual blindness that David Nurnberg recently reminded us of in his very fat book, Anti-Judaism, when he quietly remarked, "The peril of fantasizing our freedom from the past is indeed grave." Now, I have focused much of my research on conversion, as particularly of conversion of Jews to Christianity in the 14th century, particularly the work of Abner Burgos, whom you see here, who recounted his conversion in great detail when he tells of a dream that he had after falling asleep in the synagogue while praying for God's mercy. And he talks about asking for mercy on my people, the people from whom I am descended. And this is actually his conversion narrative in the surviving form. But I'd like to actually, since I think those ideas might be more familiar and I don't like to hear myself repeat myself, in order to attempt to flesh out the ideas, the generalizations and assertions I've made so far in a more concrete way, I'd like to look in depth at a particular situation that we haven't talked about yet, as far as I can tell. That is conversion between Christianity and Islam in the later 15th and early 16th century. And take up a case for which we possess a conversion narrative, a very vivid one, purportedly by the convert, telling about his conversion in a first-person voice, which is datable roughly to the events that it relates, or seems to relate. But a conversion for which we have no hard circumstantial evidence to confirm that this convert existed, although everyone treats his existence as real. That is the case of the Muslim jurist turned priest known as Juan Andrés. Juan's case might serve as one telling example of how conversion can be very problematic as a meaningful tool of analysis, even when it seems to be speaking for itself. Now, his story takes place in the same moment as that of Isabel of Solís, La Romilla, with which I began. That is, in 1487, a Muslim faqih, or religious jurist, from the city of Játiva, was visiting a nearby city of Valencia. Now, he tells that he was the son of another al-faqih named Abdallah, who died some years before, and after the death of his father, he says he followed his father in the path of their career, but then found that he was lost in his heart, until by chance he found himself in the cathedral, where in 1487, on August 15th, the Feast of the Virgin, he heard a profound catalyzing sermon that opened his eyes to the truth and gave him what he seemed to be missing, eventually leading him to convert to Christianity. He tells this story, let's see if I can find it here, in his confusion or confutation of the Mohammedan sect, la confusión o confutación de la secta Mahomet. He says, I was from the city of Khatibah, where many years before I was born and instructed and taught in the sect of Muhammad by Abdullah, my biological father, natural padre, who was a faqih in the same city. After his death, I succeeded him in his office of faqih, in which I was lost for a long time and veered off the path of truth until the year of 1487, when I found myself present in the main church of the illustrious city of Valencia on the day of Our Lady in August, when the very reverend and no less learned Master Marques was preaching. Suddenly, the shining rays of divine light removed and cleared the shadows of my understanding, and then opened the eyes of my soul. Because of the understanding I had of the sect of Muhammad, I clearly recognized that the goal of salvation for which men were created was not by that perverse and evil law, but through the holy law of Christ. Now this author, the alleged author of this anecdote, known universally as Juan Andres, claims that he was then sent to Granada by the Catholic kings to preach to the Moriscos, and that he, in fact, penned a translation of the Quran and the Hadith into the Aragonese language. And this text was extremely popular for many centuries. In fact, it was published nearly 20 times in 6 different languages, including, besides Castilian, and 4 more in Castilian, and was cited by anti-Muslim polemicists and Quran translators even into the 19th century. And in fact, I found it very interesting that the first Muslim to be elected to the United States Congress, Keith Ellison, was recently sworn in on a copy of the Quran that belonged to Thomas Jefferson, which happens to cite Juan Andres directly. Sort of an irony of history. All of the many authors who mention him make reference to his identity as being a convert from Islam named Juan Andres. And pinnacles of the field, such as Natalie Zeman Davis and Mark Meyerson, refer to this narrative as having a basis in reality. Yet what we know of this conversion comes from nowhere but this text. We possess no confirmation of his existence, except one reference to a name, Juan Andres, that appears in a list of canons from Granada from 1516, the year after this book was published. There is indeed mention in the archive of Valencia one Abdullah al-Faqih, who was a leader of the Muslim community in Khatibah precisely, one who had been brought up as being a slave from Tripoli and who was well accepted as a spiritual leader. But in fact, he was not a convert. He, after 1492, continued to lead the Muslims of Valencia and Khatibah. Could this be Juan's father, or Juan himself? Perhaps, but that would mean that the facts in the text are wrong. Such facts in the text do not help us to construct any identity, since we have no external confirmation. Perhaps the name of Abdullah was just used as a recognizable element in a story fabricated by other Christians who were taking advantage of the situation. But at the same time, it's not easy to discount his identity entirely, for in the same year this book was published, where he recounts this narrative, another book was published under the same name, but this book had nothing to do with religion. That is, the Sumario Breve de la Práctica de la Aritmética y el Curso del Arte Medieval Mercantil Bien Declarado. That is, a brief summary of the practice of arithmetic and a medieval course in the mercantile arts. That is, a book on accounting. This text has nothing to say about religion, conversion, or the identity of the author, but it happens to be by the same name, the same publisher, in the same year, in the same city. Far from clarifying the existence of Juan Andres, this text only complicates things further. And there are other details, like the Quran translation that doesn't exist in any single reference, or a number of other errors that seem particularly serious for one who was not only a Muslim jurist, but the son of a Muslim jurist. Although he claims to cite widely from hadith and tafsir, he in fact only cites 2 tafsir authors, Zamakhshari and Ibn Atiyah, and attributes the ideas of other authors to just those 2 names. The author clearly has some knowledge of Islam, but clearly also he does not have the advanced knowledge that someone who's supposed to be the spiritual leader of Valencia or Khatibah would have. But one would think, we have the name, we have the day, we have the year, we have the place, we have all of the circumstances. We should be able to know what happens in this conversion. But it is not simply for a lack of data. For even if we had abundant, more specific, verifiable information about Juan's turn from Islam to Christianity, his conversion would still be the product of this narrative. A narrative that's imagined as a retrospective account of experience. And what can we do in connecting that to the facts if we have them? What can historiography do with his conversion except cull scraps of fact and call them circumstances while leaving the central issue that we seem to be talking about, his conversion, as simply a placeholder for what we think we mean. Yet what is really an irreducible matrix of meanings, illusions, cultural assumptions that I think have their basis more in metaphor, not in event. Even if we know all the facts of any given change of religion, what can conversion be except, first of all, a figure of language? And what I'm saying here is following what linguist George Lakoff has documented as the directionality metaphor in language. That is, describing many of our intangible experiences in terms of metaphors of physical movement, turning, being up, being down, etc. We can consider for a moment, briefly, I know that time is short, but consider the many contradictory images and words that evoke what we call conversion in medieval sources. We have many words for this, don't we? In Greek, epistrepho; in Latin, vertere; in Hebrew, tshuva; nitgayer; in Arabic, irtidad; imtalla, aslama; or metaphors and expressions like to take refuge under the wings of the divine presence, or to enter into the religion, dakhala fil din. We can talk about to turn or to return, to turn into, turn away from, be a turncoat, to die, to live, to enter, to leave, to submit, to rebel, to penetrate, to be penetrated, to witness, to be witnessed. We can go on with this list. Let us imagine, if we can, what would happen if we substituted a more obvious metaphor of our own language instead of conversion, something like seeing the light, or turning the heart, or returning to the fold, and tried to have a conference called Debating Seeing the Light in Different Historical Contexts. I would suggest that the word conversion itself is no different in its metaphorical structure, and no more precise. Now, a second issue, which we don't have time to go into, but which I'll mention, beyond the impossibility of really pinning down what this metaphor seems to be talking about, is the role of narrative in constructing that meaning. We might argue that conversion, as a certain crisis and resolution plotted along a temporal trajectory, unfolds within a narrative structure that seems quite natural to it, and represents in fact a kind of plot climax. Well, the factual and logical gaps within the many different ideas of conversion seem to escape us. We can fill them in because we know how the story ends. And we inevitably are drawn with our expectations about the nature of conversion based on more familiar models. As Judith Pullman has argued, because conversion narratives in the tradition of Paul and Augustine are so common in European Christian culture, they have become a way of determining our expectations about what the convert ought to experience or do or feel. And indeed, we might add that they also determine what the convert himself or herself probably expects to happen. They themselves are highly narrativized, stylized literary models. Those of Paul's conversion in Acts, which is itself a narrative construction told from three different narrative perspectives and never told in a first-person voice. Augustine's Confessions, also determined repeatedly over the course of 8 books. And what any subsequent Christian convert would expect to happen came out of these models as much as out of what the experience may have actually been. Indeed, we might even impose such expectations in looking at non-Christian conversions, such as the famous fragment narrative of the Christian convert to Judaism, Ovadia Hager, who seems to be lending himself to a narrative in the Christian form, or the convert to Islam in Ceuta, Abdul Haq al-Islami, who equally tells us a story that fits in this plot climax model. This is not to say that conversion is not real or meaningful, but that it is the stuff of language and metaphor and symbol, first of all, not of event or fact, and that its meaning shifts according to context and reader. And history writing cannot but find itself in this very prickly position in dealing with its material, that of recognizing on the one hand, of course, the constructiveness of language, but still being compelled to make sense, to put other issues and facts and accounting together, and coming up with a coherent narrative of circumstance and event. Now, I know that time is short, so I don't want to go on too much longer. Do I have
2 minutes?
2 minutes, okay. So, let me just say that in thinking about these issues, I presented just an extreme case of the issues and options facing the historiographical discussion of conversion, which we're trying to carry on here. The historian of Islam, Bernard Lewis, for example, in speaking about the 10th century Baghdadi convert from Judaism to Islam, Yaqub ibn Kilis, who became an Egyptian vizier under the Fatimids, states, quote, Even those whose conversion was not wholly religious in origin sometimes rendered service to Islam. Although the sincerity of his conversion is not generally questioned, he was accused of favoring his former co-religionists. Now, I wonder, on what basis can we actually know what he's saying? How can we measure the sincerity of belief in a 9th century convert who left no testimony of faith, confession of heart, photographs, videos, blood samples, or other pieces of information? And how could we distinguish it from one who did? That is, we have an acute problem, that the irresolvable contradiction in understanding motives and sincerities. What in Ibn Kilis's case is purely a matter of fanciful extrapolation based on circumstances, expectations, and models. But our cases, even far more concrete and historiographically grounded cases than the famous story of Juan Andres, or the one about which we know nothing, that of Ibn Kilis, they're no less problematic, because the facts are not the problem. That is, as historians, we're forced first into the role of the homilist, representing hagiography as if it were reality, and then expecting to use it in an exemplary way, and then forced into the role of the inquisitor, probing history as on the basis of motive and sincerity and inner faith, something which escapes even our own grasp for ourselves. Now, my goal in saying all of this, in presenting these cases, is not, again, to question the reality of historical circumstance or claim that conversion stories are merely texts that have no signifying connection to reality. But really, what I want to show is that we ourselves are participating in the conversion. That conversion is not a stable or meaningful category that informs the historian's writing, and that in most cases it functions simply as an empty placeholder for a cluster of possible ideas that shift according to different cases and different contexts. And I hope that if I haven't fully converted you to my belief, I may have successfully planted a seed of doubt in your minds about the viability of treating conversion as a completely coherent entity, somehow outside of language, somehow outside of the texts that represent it. In the face of the problem of conversion for historiography, I suggest that we do best to see our work as treating not experience or belief in any abstract sense, but always, only through particular representation, offering not a history of conversion per se, in general, overall, but instead a history of the shifting and variable ways that ideas about conversion have been imagined in the texts, that images about conversion have shifted over time. For whatever may constitute the thing, the event, the fact, the circumstance in which this drama of faith unfolds, what can conversion ever really signify, apart from its symbols and metaphors? And what greater problem does historiography face than that of coherently deciphering without distortion, ideology, or prejudice these metaphorical figures of language that cloak the trammels of human memory and hide the ineffable mysteries of the human heart? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent paper. I'm sure we'll have many questions later. Okay. Okay, our respondent to the two lectures will be Professor Nimrod Horowitz, who graduated from Princeton University in 1994 and teaches here in Gurion University in the Department of Middle East Studies. His research focuses on medieval and modern Muslim religious movements and the politics of religiosity. His publications include the book, The Formation of Hanbalism, Piety into Power, 2002. It was also translated in the 2011 into Arabic. And I would mention also his research from scholarly circles to mass movements, the formation of legal communities in Islamic Society in the American Historical Review, and El Mamoun and the Michna, yeah, and the Michna in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology.
No? Can you hear me? Or should I raise the microphone? Now I hope you'll hear me better. So, there's a tradition that we start with jokes, but there's also a second tradition that respondents don't start with jokes, and I'll stick to that tradition. When we got the program, I saw that my name was under this panel of responding to converts and the idea of conversion. And I was wondering, I wasn't sure what idea of conversion is. And so I started looking around and reading, and gradually I came across Carl Morrison's book, perhaps because of your paper and other works. And Carl Morrison actually uses this term, idea of conversion, and he does so in order to differentiate between the experience of conversion itself and the discussions about the experience. In other words, he argues quite directly, one can legitimately talk about the idea of conversion, but not about the experience. Okay, and he goes into this and develops this idea quite a lot, and argues that the actual experience is what he calls something felt, whereas the description is something made. In other words, something that was written about and something that we later on create our own narratives and so on. And bearing in mind this distinction, Morrison and many subsequent scholars, including Ryan Speech, sought to devise a strategy of textual interpretation that will enable us to make sense of conversion. And this challenge lies at the heart of Speech's title, Conversion as a Historiographical Problem. And as you probably noticed, especially from the last few moments of his lecture, it lies at the center of his project. And so what I want to do is start with Speech's paper, and start with a list of warnings and difficulties that he raises all around this issue of historiography of conversion. And the first one is, of course, one that's very familiar to most historians, and that is facts. It's very difficult to understand, to know exactly what the facts are, and as he writes, is it a basis in reality? Does it have a basis in reality? Can we reconstruct the external events in a way that is accurate and that we can be certain about? And the answer obviously is no. So the first problem here is, how do you work with these facts? But that's a general problem that all historians probably have. The second one is a little bit more complicated, and that is definition. And again, as was cited here before by Speech, even if we sift the legend from the fact, we still need to define conversion. Is it an internal process, external, and so on? I won't repeat the long list that was given, just bear in mind this problem. The third one is, of course, a warning, I would say more, and that is cultural relativism. There are numerous perceptions and practices of conversion, and it's not really, and this is a very important point, it's not a generally recognizable, universally meaningful phenomena. And its perception is influenced by language, narratives, historical circumstances, and so on. So this is just to run through the warnings and the difficulties that we have when we deal with conversion as a historiographic conundrum. But what I think is very, very important in this paper and in this line of thinking is what I would call strategies of interpretation, and that is what Speech has presented us here. Following several historians, such as Paolo Fredrickson and others, that have put forth a very creative and fruitful approach, Speech argues that texts shape collective perceptions of conversion. And I want to go into that for a little further because I think this is the heart of this paper, and it's a very useful notion. So what he tries to do is to link between the internal experience and the text describing them, by treating the text not so much, of course, as repositories of facts, which they may or may not be, but as a means that disclose the imagination of the converts and their surrounding environment. And I will quote, when discussing the narratives of Paul and Augustine, he writes that they determined what the convert himself or herself may have expected, determined what any subsequent Christian convert expected would happen, and understood what he or she may have experienced or desired to experience. I think this is a crucial element here, because what he's telling us is that when somebody writes a text, obviously they don't come in as a carte blanche, they're not empty. They have some ideas about what conversion is. And these ideas actually come from previous texts, from previous discussions about conversion. Therefore, the text that we analyze can actually be, when we're analyzing this text, we can actually look at the way that people in that society, in that culture, think about conversion. And this, in my opinion, is what leads us into, or gives us insight into what the idea of conversion is. In other words, when I had to solve my own problem of what the organizers meant when they said idea of conversion, reading through this paper, I could actually see how this works. So what we have here, and I think this is the heart of the issue, is a situation in which we can decipher how a specific society perceives conversion by looking at the texts that create its collective idea of conversion. And this kind of analysis, which does not have to even go into the issue of whether the fact is precise or not, but rather as something that indicates what the mentality is, what the ideas are within that society, is I think the most important element that we get in this venue, or this trajectory of research. Now, of course, like every venue or every trajectory of research, we have limitations. And so one thing that's very obvious here, and that's been said in the article itself, is that we must think in terms of cultural specificity. In other words, nothing here is general, nothing here is universal. And this is where George Orota's study, Conversions from Christianity to Islam in Persia during the Safavid period, comes in. Because more than anything, when placed alongside of speeches, articles, and case studies, it demonstrates this issue of cultural relativism when we talk about conversion. So George Orota's study is of Christian converts in Persia, and it tells a very different conversion story than that of the intellectuals that construct worldviews and write texts and read these texts and so on. In his cases, spiritual agency is substituted very often by force or submission, and individual meditations are substituted by corralled masses of youths. And I want to use a few of your cases, the case studies that you presented, in order to widen the scope here and say that it's not just Christians converting to Islam, to Shia Islam in Persia. We're talking about something much, much wider that has lasted for about 1,000 years. We're talking here, or part of it is in relation to what you just said, the slave soldiers. Now, the slave soldiers are usually children around the age of 10 that have been captured in battle or in raids that were searching for slaves, and that have been occasionally even sold by their parents, and when they're brought over, they are educated in a variety of ways, especially, of course, in warfare, but they're also converted. And that kind of situation is obviously extremely different in terms of what conversion there means, and There, that raises the issue of forced conversion that was raised in the previous article. It also points to parents who sell their children, knowing probably that their children will not maintain their faith. In other words, they are Christians and they're selling their children, and they know that these children will become Muslims. And that actually highlights a very interesting point, and that is a very different premium that is put on faith and on conversion in these different societies. So all of this, of course, goes to show us this relativism, historic, and so on, or we can say that we have very different ideas of, we should not be really talking about an idea of faith, but rather ideas of conversions. And I would like to conclude with 3 points, that remarks or observations or questions. Obviously, there are several types of conversions, as we said. Some of them, as Speech has pointed out and has worked on this as material, devised a sophisticated, and his approach has devised a sophisticated tool for the study of highly literate intellectual individuals who write, contemplate, and possess agency. However, as Giorgio Rota's cases demonstrate, some of the most important manifestations of conversion, at least for the Islamic world, have little to do with that kind of an experience. Even more than that, texts are just one element. Texts are just one element that creates the idea of conversion. For example, stories about friends and relatives that have converted probably contribute to these notions of what a convert is about, imagines he's doing. Perhaps, or very, very important, is the law. Written or told constitutes another important source that contributes to this idea of conversion. Maybe we should be talking about not just narrative, but nomos and narrative of conversion. And therefore, the idea of conversion and this concept, which I think is a very interesting tool for analysis, should be put in a much wider framework of law, rumors, historical events, historical circumstances, and so on. And through that, we can actually get a much richer and wider understanding of this idea of conversion. A second point that I'd like to make, just as a side remark, is that methodologically we're in good company here. And the relations between the individual's internal intellectual, spiritual, and emotional dynamics and those of the collective norms that surround him and that are shared by society, this poses a methodological problem that has been addressed by historians of emotions and histoire et mentalité in the past, and I think it's worth looking at the way that they have dealt with this and treated this. And lastly, I want to refer to one of Speech's sentences, which he also cited in the lecture, and I will repeat it. I would urge us to spend more time reflecting on what we actually mean when we name and study conversion in any given historical context, before we move on to organize the information. I emphasize organize the information we think we know about conversion and its circumstances. And this is obviously a very, I think, useful comment for any group that's about to build a database, which the heart of it is organizing information, and therefore
presenting information.
Okay, now we're circulating. And I would like to hear both what Speech has to say about that and what the rest of us have to say about that, because I think this is a crucial question for this conference in general. Thank you.
Very much, Lord Horvitz. And okay, we have 3 fascinating papers, lectures, and now I open the room for discussions and questions. Yes, please, in the back there. Oh, you. Yes.
Thanks for 2 great papers and a really thoughtful response to the papers. I wanted to ask directly to you, Ryan, about your paper, and then open the question to both of you. I think if you were to give another talk and you called it Conversion as the Historian's Problem, how might we also connect to the question, Ryan, that you raised about what work does conversion do for the scholar? So why is there an I-core specifically on conversion instead of like a broader issue? And to think about if conversion is a construction and created by the scholar, then it seems also it's helpful to do an interrogation of why we choose conversion, care about it, and what kind of work we want it to do. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. And it seems to me a necessary connection to make between sort of the instability of conversion as a category of analysis. It has to be connected to the historian or the anthropologist or whoever. So and then maybe if both of you might say, like in your work, like what do you feel like your studies of conversion have contributed in a way that you feel makes contributions to the wider academy or across fields that might not be necessarily within the study of conversion, but relate to other historical processes or moments?
Sure, thanks. So I think that conversion is incredibly important, and we can't do without it because it does this very important work of being a placeholder. That is, it functions in the way we need it to function to link together these many different things. And that's good. It does it in the way other categories work. We can think of other gigantic categories that are easily seen as created, factitious, and kind of absurd, like the Middle Ages, maybe, or other gigantic constructions like that, which we just put there and they hold a lot of things for us, and that we can move them around. And that's very important, and I think that's the work conversion does. It holds the place for our shifting and varied models. And what I'm urging is that and I think that this has been done in many other cases, many of these, obviously, no one has the illusion that the Middle Ages is not a constructed category. But I think that less work has been done remembering that every time we use this word, we're using it as a placeholder for other things, and that it's not there. Right? That what it is depends very much on the circumstances, depends on our perspective, depends on the tools we're using, the methodologies. And so I think that it's more important to have the discussion, particularly about conversion, because it's so maybe well hidden from view. It seems so natural, and obviously we make sense of it. So what I'm urging is that we think about that variability and really use it to our advantage, to think of a way that the methodological differences, all of the many varied metaphors that it includes could be actually expanded. We can make more sense of what people think at any given time if we ourselves know what we're bringing to the table when we interpret that metaphor. And I think my work on it is not to try to, first, certainly, as I said, not to kind of reduce everything to a web of text and say it's all a game. That's not at all what I'm saying, and I'm not saying that we can't talk about things, real history, in a sense. What I am saying is that we have, this is one of those very tender spots where in the wake of the linguistic turn, or whatever you want to call it, the work it's doing can be very dangerous, because we can bring far too much to the table and confuse it with what we're talking about, with reality or with history or with the people we're analyzing, if we don't analyze the discourse. So what I want to do with what I've said about conversion, I think it can be applied more generally, and it has in lots of other places. That is, historians have thought a lot about what it means to talk about discourse and to read text. And I think this is one case in which something is kind of hidden in plain sight, but I wanted to shine the spotlight on it more intensively. There are possibly other things, and I would welcome suggestions about what they might be, other of these kinds of useful yet dangerous metaphors that we're constantly using. But in this case, I think conversion functions very well because it brings together such a wide variety of possibilities, and yet we couldn't function without it. I mean, really, it's doing very important work in our intellectual histories and in our social histories too. So I think it can be applied more generally, but it also, we can remember, it has been this insight. So I think that's how I would respond to those parallel questions. I don't know if it particularly what you think, if you wanted to jump in, what you think conversion kind of does as a important work in analyzing your sources, if you think it's really a variable phenomenon at all.
I have to say that I started to become interested in the issue of conversion from, I think, a different perspective of most of you probably, even all of you. I mean, not from the point of view of religious studies, not from the point of view of history of ideas, and basically from the point of view of military history. And again, military history is can be history of battles and feats of arms, great men, as it used to be until a long time ago. It can be a history of weapons. There are buffs who knows everything about how certain tank function, and all their life revolves about certain rifle or whatever. But of course, you can do military history with an eye to both things. And social history, military history. I mean, also military history is a great tool to study societies, to interpret societies. And so basically, I started with from the point of view of military slavery, as Nimrod said, something that I forgot to mention actually, the fact that these famous Rolams that I mentioned are basically a late stage in the history of Islamic military history. And this is why I started to work on the problem, because I mean, who are these fellows? I mean, of course, they are Christians. They are Christians who turn Muslims, but then not all of them turn Muslim under the same circumstances. Some of them remain faithful to their employer. Some of them don't. And then it turns out that there is a military market in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire, in Persia, and as there was a military market in Europe at the same time, 16th century, 17th century, we are in a period where national states do not exist yet. So all what counts is loyalty, personal loyalty to a ruler, to an idea, to faith. And I have to say that I agree with what Nimrod said at the end. I think, but you said it before, I think, about the necessity to reflect, because before organizing, before collecting and organizing data. In our field, basically, especially for us, historians of Iran, we have so little data to organize together that basically, if we also think about them before, we'll never go anywhere. But of course, can you say, the issue of agency, I mean, these people had an agency, of course. I mean, they were not, can you say, they were not brutes, they were not senseless, they were not natural beings that just, say, lived on and followed the stream. The problem is, of course, conversion is connected to identity, of course. And identity, again, is a word that is used very often. It's a very important question. It's a question that we must ask ourselves: what is identity? The problem, but in my opinion, it's a question that we have the duty to ask, being aware that we are most probably not going to reach a final answer, no matter what is the amount of information, of sources, and the quality of the sources that we have at our disposal. We will never reach a final, definitive answer. I don't know if it makes sense, more or less. I provided an answer to what you said before. But
yes, please.
Well, just to pick up on the question of identity, and actually to pivot off Craig's question, and I don't really know the Safavid period, but for the Western Middle Ages, the main type of conversion that comes up in narrative texts, of course, is that from the secular life to the religious life. And so far, we've really been talking about Judaism to Christianity, Christianity to Islam, back and forth, and all the rest. But that seems to me the really key typology with which we can sort of compare, and which might help to get at the question of identity, and certainly with one of reflecting on the role of texts and the role that the texts play in sort of helping to construct that. So my question is sort of really more directed towards Ryan and asking if you could sort of place conversion text as you're interested in a sort of a interfaith, interreligious context, really in the parameters of the one that really shows up the most frequently in Western Middle Ages, which is that from the secular to the religious life. And I'd actually like to know what one finds in the Islamic world as well, especially as on the question of identity. Is the secular to the religious life the same motif that you find there, and if not, it's something that's worthy of comparison, I think.
So one thing that I've done in trying to take this narrative approach, the ones I've looked at are all very heavily narrative, is to look at also contemporary narratives of that exact kind of thing we could call conversion from the secular life to the religious life. And in particular, one that I found long and fruitful as far as a story is a story of Ramon Llull. And I positioned him kind of in between all these guys. He's a Catalan mystic and polymath and author of nearly 300 books and missionary to Islam. And he tells his story twice in his life, trying to talk about how he had a series. He was a kind of idle youth, and he went about composing love poetry for his girlfriends, and he was just settling down one sunny night or one warm night to compose a poem for his most recent girl, and then he had a vision of Christ. And he got scared and put it away and went to bed, and then this recurred. And so it has all the trappings of a regular conversion story, like the religious stories that I looked at, but his story is not at all changing religions. He's just getting religion, right? He found religion. And of course then, this is itself no less constructed or artificial in the way he creates his narrative as a way to authorize his own project, which he then undertakes. Because God visits him, tells him what he has to do, he decides to write a book, the best book in the world, to convert the Muslims, and that's when he starts out constructing his art, which is the basis of all of his 200 and some works. And I don't think there's a single bit of difference between the way that's represented and the way the other kinds of turns, you might say, from one religion to another are represented. And I wanted to try to apply that more broadly as a place where it's not always that case. So in looking at a few examples of the language used in these stories of becoming Jewish, that I found more from earlier, say things that we're looking at the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th. The words used also get at this problem. So there's, on the one hand, the discussion of tshuva, right? The heart goes back, or one finds God again, one returns. And then there's the discussion of people from outside who come to join, right? Giyur, or whatever, the people who are the gerim, who join. And so I was fascinated to find which word was used when, and especially to find when the one I expected was not used. So for example, in some of the documents of the Khazar case, the discussion of the Khazars, one of the stories tells about, the guy who was strong in battle, and he himself had a Jewish past, and so he experienced tshuva, and that led everybody else. But it doesn't say then that the Khazars, who are not Jews, who followed him, underwent some sort of, giyur, becoming a ger or gerim, but that they too, the word naturally that followed in the text is that he had tshuva, and then they had a kind of tshuva. He led them in tshuva. And I was shocked to think, wow, well, that's not the word that should be used. Suddenly it's, you're talking about a turn, when really they're going from not a non-religion or no religion to religion. And so I thought in that case it's a really interesting difference, how what you expect according to this paradigm doesn't fit what you find when you interpret the text. Whereas in Christianity, I didn't make a study of this, but the ones that I found, the narrative representation seems identical to me in those sources that I looked at. So I think that the paradigm of going from one to the other, it doesn't matter whether you're drawing a division, you're really actually going from untruth to truth. And that's where I was coming to kind of suggest that the way conversion is used in a social science sense has this resonance of going from error to truth in a way that seems to be taken over from really the very origins of the term, which I think go back to a kind of Neoplatonic ascent to truth, sloughing off error, moving towards truth, which then gets overlaid with Judeo-Christian language in particular. But really, if you strip it off, there's still that basic core, which is that Neoplatonic thing, which is earlier than Christianity, right? It has this kind of idea of just turning away from error and turning towards truth, which you can even find in, say, the 3rd century BC or something, with this discussion of the same kind of language that then becomes operative in Christianity. So I think that's why, for me, in Christianity, there's no difference, or I don't see a big difference. Whereas in other cases, when we start saying all of it is conversion, that's holding a place for suddenly 4 different things, maybe. And it's really not at all appropriate to say that the Khazar case is really discussing that same thing. Because what is it discussing? It's not discussing necessarily tshuva. It certainly doesn't have a kind of Neoplatonic resonance to it, I don't think. So the question for me, I could answer it in those 2 ways. Is one about how I've looked at the Christian, and one looking at the Muslim, or the Jewish. The Muslim stuff that I've looked at, I don't want to get into it, it'd be a long answer, but I think that it could also complicate the problem too, because it obviously presents a different paradigm, again. And I don't think that one word moving freely between those is at all descriptive. I think it's doing what I'm saying, just sort of holding a place for what we then know what we mean when we get into those contexts. But maybe if you could say about the Islamic context in Iran, maybe.
You meant transition from secular to religious within the same religion. I vaguely seem to remember some cases from, very few cases from pre-modern Iran of people who become usually, secular persons becoming usually Sufis. They live the material life, ordinary life, they become Sufis, mystics. But what I've seen does not allow generalizations. Again, we have the problem of the sources. Persian sources for the before 1850 are very are what they are. Relatively meager, and they don't allow much in much space in terms of social history. But for sure, there are some cases in the sources. What comes to my mind is poetry, of course, Persian lyrical poetry, where of course you have very often the topos of what can you say, of material love, worldly love, as a metaphor for divine love. So the poet writes about women or men accordingly, since there is no gender in the Persian language, writes about wine, but actually writes about, or pretends, or claims he's writing about the love for God. But again, this is a topos, this is a literary topos, and it's also a tradition that goes back, as Ryan said, up to the Neoplatonic ideas. So we never know. We can't know if the poet is speaking about religious, a real experience, or it's just repeating the topos. Something which is also very classic in Persian literature is the opposite. And for instance, the topos of the Muslim, of the pious Muslim, or sometimes also of the man of religion who abandons Islam for the sake of wine, for the sake of a beautiful girl, for the sake of a beautiful boy, and but also this also is a topos. We know, of course, that pre-modern Iran had a very rich, let's say, underworld life. So events of this kind, of course, are attested also in narrative sources. But again, we don't know exactly where the boundary between reality and fiction is. But this passage, the transition from state of piety, the state of, let's say, religious faithfulness, to, let's say, moral decay, is decried by the poet himself, of course, more or less in the same way as a Christian, let's say, would have decried, would have criticized the passage from Christianity to Islam. For whatever reason you do it, you live truth and embrace falsehood.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, so please, short questions and short answers, please. Please.
Yes, no, it was just really just follow up on this about the Islamic sources, because I look at the sources from Spain and the Maghreb, and there we do have a lot of information, basically in the form of hagiography. So, you know, lots of biographies of Sufis and ascetics, and especially those who are preachers, where, you know, as a result of listening to a sermon or something, you have a person who's completely secular, a musician or something like this, someone who's leading a sinful life, and who, you know, who repents. They use this. But they tend to use a different term. They tend to use the word aslama when they're talking about someone who's not Muslim at all and converting to Islam. So I've seen this quite a bit, a difference in terminology.
Yeah, I mean, you just might say too, like, the autobiography of Al-Ghazali is really, I think, I don't know about in particular in Spain, but it seems to be very influential in terms of establishing this kind of paradigm of finding the way, you know, the deliverance from error. So the idea of becoming a friend of God, joining the ranks of the awliya, I think that's probably far more common, at least in a narrative form, in Islam anyway. And I'm kind of guessing, I don't really know that, but it just seems from what I've seen to be far more common to talk about that. Getting religion when you're already kind of a bad Muslim, to getting more piety, than it is to talk about really narrativizing, at least, going from non-Muslim to Muslim, where it's just a thing that happens, right? They don't dwell on it.
Okay, one more question, Kenneth, please, very short.
Yeah, I want to say something which may be obvious, or at least it hasn't been said directly, which is there's the conversion of the convert, whatever that means for a second, and the conversion that's expected by the institution. And these are really two entirely separate things, processes. And in study, we have to do that. And also, if you're baptized, it's an act, it's finished. If you're a convert, and I've seen this, it can be a long process going on over many years with one giant step forward and two steps backwards and in continuity. And so to describe the conversion of a person who converts as a fait accompli is probably dangerous if we're looking at reality. Whereas from the point of view of the institution, you joined, that's it.
I would like to thank very much for the three professors, Giorgio Rota, Ryan Speed, Timo Gore,